Hello everyone, and welcome back to our Damn analysis series. Today we're going to be analysing the 5th track, Feel. From the second we enter this track, we can hear that the idea of nobody praying for Kendrick is one that is integral to the album, with it being repeated throughout this intro. Once again, Kendrick feels lost and alone, with any hope for the future seeming completely barren. The act of praying is of course the form of communication between humans and God. People who pray every day simply want to make God aware they're thankful for his blessings. However, the act of praying for someone else is usually done to plead God for blessings on another person. We can see here that Kendrick believes that not only is God not giving any blessings for his own prayers, but also that he's hopeless in getting anyone else to give him their prayers. This takes us to the first verse, where we can already see every single line includes the word feel. This reinforces the concept of heavily focusing on emotions which this album is taking, and also tells us that this verse is most likely going to be more blunt in how Kendrick is describing how he's feeling. He starts by saying that he feels there's a chip on his shoulder, a phrase which is used to describe a lingering feeling of resentment, mainly revolved around an inferiority complex, and typically manifesting in extreme, oftentimes aggressive behaviour. From the previous songs in Damn, we know this to be the case with Kendrick, with the chip on his shoulder most likely spawning out of his passionate feelings towards race and the injustice which faces the black community. The following lyrics essentially show us Kendrick's deepest internal thoughts, being somewhat garbled and incoherent. He first says he's losing his focus and patience, which we could assume would relate to his music and the message which he preaches, with the lack of hope he's currently experiencing making him disorientated, not being able to do and say the kind of things he did on TPAB, because no real progress has been made in his eyes. Because of this, he started losing patience. Not only is no change occurring, but he also can't get his thoughts straight, most likely questioning his own morality and ethics, with many more existential thoughts clearly floating around his mind. He reinforces this idea when he states that he feels his thoughts are in the basement, not only representing the ideas themselves, but also how others perceive them. Kendrick's inner thoughts are starting to become darker due to this lack of hope, but at the same time it can also translate to the external world, once again with all of the messages in his music being overshadowed and ignored in the grander scheme of things. A prime example obviously being the Fox News segment which was heard earlier in the album. Talking of the Fox News segment, Kendrick seems to address these kinds of people when he says he feels like they're miseducated. This is not only aimed at the people who took his message and twisted it in a way to only have a bad takeaway from it, but also anyone that holds racist beliefs in general. When you break it down, most forms of racism do genuinely spawn out of being miseducated and believing in something that just isn't true. Of course, the overall belief in relation to these racist ideals is that black people are not equal to white people, both in a physical and physiological standpoint. This of course is objectively untrue, with the only biological difference being the pigment of our skin, which of course has no effect on anything in relation to the actual person. The miseducation and blatant ignorance from people like this feeds back into Kendrick losing his patience, ultimately saying that if they're just going to stay in their ways and not accept his message, he doesn't want to be bothered by them. Kendrick acknowledges that he didn't used to be like this. He was always the one wanting to find out people's perspectives, no matter what stance they came from, and present his own perspective as well. However, after trying countless times, he's retreated into his own shell and doesn't want to interact with anything, claiming that he thinks these people are the problem. This leads to Kendrick saying fuck the world, also saying that he feels like there's no tomorrow. This could be linking back to Kendrick's battles with mental health issues, mentioning several times throughout his career the depressive and suicidal thoughts he's had to get through. This shows that what he's talking about here is genuinely important to him. This isn't just the famous Kendrick Lamar that everybody knows has an emphasis on racial issues. This is what he thinks about day in and day out, whether he's appearing in the public eye or in private. The frustration he's conveying through his lyrics isn't just being presented because that's how you think he should feel with the state of the world. It's genuinely just how he feels. We then get two lines which serve as a turning point in the verse, which also happen to be the only lyrics excluding the word feel, where Kendrick once again shows his distaste towards certain people's actions, and tells us that because of how these people act, the world's starting to end, and says fuck you to anyone who's offended. Kendrick started off the track being more vague and using metaphors to describe his feelings, but the increasing frustration results in his lyrics becoming a lot more blatant and impactful. It amazes me just how much Kendrick has focused on this idea of people misrepresenting his message, with the Fox News segment most likely serving as a catalyst for this. It's become clear at this point that this moment had a profound effect on Kendrick, with him perhaps not holding specific reservations for how these people perceived his performance, but almost like he's witnessed too many people repeating the same things that they claimed when talking about him, taking Kendrick to his boiling point. After this point, Kendrick focuses on how he feels in relation to his fame, and how people around around him have changed. He starts by questioning his friends, something we've seen him do several times previously, and says he feels they're overrated. This is a sentiment that's not only shared by Kendrick, but a lot of people in general. Despite it usually stemming from trust issues in relation to past experiences, Kendrick questions why it's so important to have friends, and starts weighing up the genuine qualities they bring to his life. This may just be a new revelation, with his friends acting different after he gained wealth and status, but at the same time, this could have been a thought lingering in Kendrick's mind for a while. Will his friends really be there when he needs them most? Are they really there because they like him as a person, or simply want to use him for their own needs? All these kinds of questions lead to Kendrick becoming tired of the idea entirely, labeling friends as overrated, being too much of a hassle to deal with. But on top of this, he also feels like his family's been faking, and that their feelings are changing. This could relate to an idea we saw on songs like You Ain't Gotta Lie off T-Pab. With Kendrick now being famous, he fears how people perceive him in his hometown. It once again comes back to lying, whether it be in order to gain something, or perhaps to spare Kendrick's feelings. Kendrick then says he feels his thoughts of compromise is jaded, and that people want to scrutinize how he made it. The idea of compromise could relate to both his own career and his message, both coming with their own compromises. In the music industry, it's inevitable Kendrick would at some point have to make certain compromises in his art, so that it pleases people higher up in the chain than him. But doing this also means that he's not being able to get his message out as unfiltered and raw as he possibly wants, almost being censored in a way. On top of that, the message he's constantly putting out is also one of compromise, wanting to unify everyone and figure out a way to stop any violence and just spread peace and positivity. However, with how bitter and twisted Kendrick's mind is getting due to all these outside influences, he's starting to feel jaded in that mission. He recognizes people around him also wanting to scrutinize the way he made it to the place he's currently in, which feeds back into why he's starting to become more introverted and reclusive. The facts are all out there, and Kendrick's already established several times that he's got nothing to hide. So the idea of some jealous person doubting him and questioning his truth is once again just too tiring to deal with. This leads into the final lyrics of the verse, where Kendrick describes feeling completely disconnected from everyone, which feels like a twisted irony, considering Kendrick was previously seen as the leader of his community, bringing everyone together, and because of this, he wants to completely remove himself, in both an emotional sense and a physical sense. He can't take all the pressure that's been consistently thrown his way throughout his career, so not only removes his feelings and investment in anything that he once cared about, but also physically wants to get away from all these stresses, and either move away as far as he can, or try to hide away in his home. This is where we can see just how integral it was that Kendrick consistently used the word feel on this track. It not only serves as an interesting way of delivering his lyrics, but also makes us more aware and interested in his mindset, whilst at the same time making us aware this is all coming from his sole perspective. This takes us to a short chorus, before going into a second verse. Kendrick starts this verse focusing on money, and the things people do with it. He says he feels people are out of pocket, meaning to be out of line and wild, and that they're tapping their pockets, almost signaling to Kendrick that they want his money. This once again reinforces the idea of Kendrick not trusting anyone outside his closest family, because he's worried people want to use him solely for his money. On top of this, Kendrick also should be concerned about any generosity he decides to give to anyone else, with many people using any cash he gives out for useless and frivolous things. Kendrick, more than anyone, should know this, with a large bulk of T-Pab focusing on his fame and wealth, questioning the kind of things he's getting himself into, and if they're good or bad for him. He links the way he feels about people who want to use him to the rap game, claiming that he's a legend, and everyone below him knows that, and are jealous. These lines follow a similar sentiment to the ones we saw in Element, even comparing himself to Michael Jordan, someone who's considered to be one of, if not the greatest basketball player of all time. He describes that no matter how he's feeling, within a second of him going up on stage with a mic in his hand, all these lingering bitter thoughts exit his mind. Performing is the only real escape for Kendrick, not feeling the presence of these desperate and jealous peasants who either want to copy him or use him as a way to get more famous themselves. It makes sense why Kendrick uses the phrase "I am legend" here, as the way he describes himself does make him seem like this lone figure against the world, much like in the Will Smith film I Am Legend. This is only reinforced further in the upcoming lines, elevating himself above his supposed competition and telling them that he could teach them a lesson in how to act and how to improve their music. Kendrick at some points feels like he's got nothing else than him and his music, the two things in his life he feels he has most control over. He doesn't think these feelings are mutual between the people he was previously referring to, calling these artists out on their fake personas. On top of this, Kendrick makes reference to Sun Tzu's famous text, The Art of War, when mentioning that his competition should know their enemies, which from Kendrick's perspective most likely means himself. This is similar to a passage in chapter 3 which reads, "It is said that if you know your enemies and know yourself, you will not be imperiled in 100 battles. If you do not know your enemies but do know yourself, you'll win one and lose one. If you do not know your enemies nor yourself, you'll be imperiled in every single battle." The idea of this, of course, is that if you aren't confident in your own ability, but are also unaware of someone else's ability, you'll always end up losing. This is how Kendrick perceives everyone else in the rap game, underestimating him, whilst also not being truthful to themselves about how lesser quality their music is when being compared to Kendrick's. We then see Kendrick compare his life to drugs, claiming that his feelings of no hope feel like bad dope, a quarter ounce manipulated from soap. Oftentimes, drug dealers will attempt to save or make up for the product they do or don't have, with soap being frequently used in dummy rocks, due to the similarities in colour and texture. Whoever uses this fake manufactured product will have a much more unsatisfactory experience than someone using pure rocks, being comparable to how Kendrick is currently feeling in his own life, unsatisfied, and feeling like the only person who's being real. These lyrics can also be assumed to be closely personal and relatable to Kendrick, with him recounting his first experience with marijuana being a bad one, which is found on the song Mad City. The first time he ever tried weed, it was laced with PCP, and as he describes in that song, it had him foaming at the mouth. The next couple lines also refer back to things Kendrick has touched on before, with the ideas of false freedom, and in particular, Ronald Reagan's presidency. The feeling of false freedom was especially prevalent while Kendrick was growing up, being born in 1987, however is still present today. A key thing to distinguish in any society you live in is that just because there's certain laws in place to stop things like racism, doesn't mean it's just going to stop, and in fact gives higher powers even more leeway to sneakily torment these minorities from behind the scenes, under the guise of equality and fairness. For example, the infamous crack epidemic during the 80s and 90s was heavily believed to be coordinated by Reagan and the CIA, in which people theorized that they spread crack throughout poor and divided communities like Compton to not only ruin their quality of life even further, but also to imprison them easier. What fits even further into this theory is that Reagan eventually ended up passing aggressive legislation against drug violations, seeing over 50,000 people imprisoned in 1980, and more than 400,000 by 1997. These poor communities were almost force-fed this poisonous drug, and in turn became addicted, which then led to these higher powers who initially fed them this poison, locking them up in jail, feeding into this cycle of false freedom. No matter how much of a choice you think you initially have, you'll come to find that these higher powers are already aware of your potential, and want to make you as dumbed down and normal as everyone else around you. Kendrick once again describes the loneliness and isolation he feels, giving him anxiety, and making simple human functions like breathing and resting a struggle. Much like we've already seen, trying to help himself can already seem like an impossible task at points, so adding his attempts to try save his community on top of that will naturally leave Kendrick with a large amount of stress and concern. No matter how much he gives to his community and tries to help the people around him, it never seems to do him any favours, which in turn makes him feel heartless at points. We saw similar ideas to this in Mortal Man, wanting to be comparable to someone like Mandela, who's most known for his emphasis on forgiveness and love. However, it still seems like Kendrick is struggling to have the same amount of restraint and forgiveness that Mandela had. Despite how privileged he knows he is compared to most people around him, he can't help but feel depressed from time to time. There's a false impression that a lot of people share, thinking that money and fame will inevitably bring happiness, an idea that has been proven time and time again to not be entirely true. It undeniably makes life easier than someone who's homeless and has no money, but can oftentimes affect someone's mental state even worse, as certain goals and aspirations get thrown to the wayside when you realise that after you've attained a certain amount of wealth, you quite literally don't have to do anything anymore. This is what Kendrick refers to in the line filling the void of being employed with ballin', showing Kendrick's awareness at his life compared to others, with there now being a void where ambition once was, only knowing how to fill it with temporary reliefs. Kendrick becomes matter of fact with how he thinks the world works, feeding into a cycle of pumping money back into banks, filling graves with dead fathers, who in places like Compton may have been victim of gang violence or overdosing on drugs, and filling the youth with bullshit, an aspect that's been heavily scrutinised and contested in schools, with governments trying to rewrite their dark history by reteaching it to kids at an early age, trying to change and obscure the facts, so the next generation has a better impression of the people that run their country. Kendrick brings up arguably his biggest inspiration, Tupac, and claims this must be how he was feeling when fighting for what he he believed in, making reference to Tupac's debut album, Tupacalypse Now, an album which focused heavily on themes like police brutality, poverty, and black-on-black crime. The idea of feeling like an apocalypse is happening links back to Kendrick's lack of hope for the future, but it seems he's coming to terms with it, describing the feeling as not awkward, but simply toxic. Kendrick at this point is simply observing his surroundings and predicting what the future will be if things stay the way they are. He's already tried several times to change how things will pan out, but has almost given up at this point. Kendrick then lists off all the demons he's currently fighting in his life, both metaphorical and literal. He's fighting his inner demons and monsters, the internal thoughts which scratch at the back of his mind and throw him back into depressive ways of thinking, much like they did on TPAB. He witnesses false prophets scheming as a way to get money off people, which both could feed into his genuine religious beliefs, with there being numerous figures who simply use religion as a way to earn cash, but could also be relating back to figures in the rap game, preaching about things they don't really believe in, or have no true knowledge and experience of. He links this to sponsors and industry promises, feeding into a bigger image of the overall economic landscape, with all these activities and sponsorships all being a way to get money, which, when you remove it from its societal implications, is simply a worthless piece of paper, or a number on a screen. We then see that Kendrick's focus is American society in general, listing off several derogatory terms for both white and black people, before bringing up church and religion. The two initially don't seem to link, however looking at the overall album, it works in Damn's effort to touch on a broad range of subjects, and look at the dichotomy between good and evil. Kendrick also mentions lawsuit visits, which could be in reference to a couple of lawsuits he had to deal with in relation to the samples in his earlier work. The most recent of which before this album was a lawsuit from Bill Withers over a sample from his song Don't You Want to Stay. The final thing he mentions is having a subpoena served in concert, with a subpoena being a legal document requiring your appearance in court. This specific instance happened to artist Kira, in which she was handed these papers on stage while performing at the LA Pride Festival in 2013. All of these things seem so ridiculous and abhorrent to Kendrick, eventually leading him to explode, and let his feelings be known to the imposters that he appears to be surrounded by. This aggressive tone stays throughout the next few lines, as he makes reference to the phoenix, which is an immortal bird that's detailed in Greek mythology. It has several similarities to Jesus Christ, the most blatant of which is the description of how it dies in a show of flames and combustion, only to be born again. Diving into mythology, Kendrick also acknowledges that dream is more than a process, and that he can create a regime which forms a Loch Ness. This references the Loch Ness Monster, which akin to Bigfoot has had its existence questioned for years. The Loch Ness Monster is a fairly recognizable and distinct image, with Kendrick most likely bringing it up to make us think further into these mythological and mystical beasts. These can also be found in Revelation 13, which in that instance signifies the rise of the Antichrist and the end of the world. As we reach the end of the verse, Kendrick simply reinforces what he's been talking about the entire track, feeling like he should say something to help his community, feeling like he should take something for his own as opposed to always giving stuff away, and feeling like he should skate off and isolate himself away from everyone else. He finishes the verse by recognizing the meaning of his music to millions of people, and how he's become one of the most popular and impactful artists of his generation, with just how good his previous projects have been, and how intricate, intelligent, and detailed his lyrics are. Entering a new project must now come with a huge amount of pressure, constantly being concerned with the quality of his music in comparison to his past projects, and if he's saying anything as meaningful as he said in the past. Kendrick's recounted several times he's been told from fans that his music saved them, or gave them someone to relate to when it seemed like they had nobody else. Kendrick is more than happy to be that person, and pray for everybody he can, but doesn't feel the same amount of love back. This takes us to the outro, where Kendrick simply repeats the lines "Ain't nobody praying for me" in a very melancholic tone. This takes us to the next track, Loyalty, which we'll be analysing next time in our Damn Analysis series. If you guys enjoyed, make sure to subscribe with notifications on, like the video, share to someone you know, and let me know your thoughts in the comments. Anyways, hope you guys enjoyed, and I'll see you in the next one. Peace.